What happens when the most controversial umpire in baseball history meets the most unstoppable force the sport has ever seen? You get 6 overturned calls in a single game. You get a manager thrown out of his own dugout. You get CB Buckner, the man they called the king of bad calls, standing on a Major League Baseball field for the very last time, completely finished. And you get Shohei Ohtani, standing 60 feet away, absolutely speechless. There are moments in sports that don't feel real while they're happening. The stadium goes quiet in a strange way. Players look at each other from across the diamond. Managers freeze mid-argument with their hands still raised. And somewhere in the stands, 50,000 people simultaneously realize they are watching something they will describe to people for the rest of their lives. That is exactly what happened the day CB Buckner worked what would become his final game behind the plate. 6 calls. 6 reversals. 1 manager ejected. And a player who had seen almost everything baseball could throw at him standing in the batter's box with an expression that said, simply and completely, that he had no words for what he was witnessing. The robot umpires had arrived. And they had arrived with a message. 30 years of bad calls had just run out of time. To understand why this moment landed the way it did, you have to understand who CB Buckner is and what he has represented in professional baseball for 3 decades. Buckner came up through the umpiring ranks the way most officials do, slowly, quietly, through the minor leagues, working games nobody was watching, building the kind of experience that eventually earns you a spot on the biggest stage in American sports. He reached the major leagues and carved out a career that lasted 30 years. 30 years is a long time. Long enough to work World Series games. Long enough to become a recognized presence in every stadium in the league. Long enough for players, managers, broadcasters, and fans to form very strong opinions about your work. And the opinions about CB Buckner were, to put it gently, divided. His supporters pointed to his longevity and his experience. You don't work 30 years in Major League Baseball by being incompetent. The game is too fast, too precise, too unforgiving of officials who cannot keep up with the level of play at the highest level of the sport. His critics pointed to something else entirely. The calls. The specific, documented, repeatedly discussed, occasionally televised calls that seem to consistently go in directions that the replay technology, introduced progressively over the years, simply could not support. Strikes that were balls. Balls that were strikes. Tag plays where the glove missed the runner by a clear margin and the hand went up anyway. Safe calls on slides that the camera angle from 3 different directions showed were not safe. It began in the minor leagues, where the league used the lower levels of professional baseball as a testing ground for technology that would eventually reshape how the sport's most fundamental judgment call, ball or strike, was made. The system used a combination of tracking technology and defined strike zone parameters to determine, with a precision no human eye could match, whether a pitch crossed the plate within the boundaries of the rulebook zone. The results in the minor leagues were impossible to ignore. Pitch calls became consistent. Arguments at the plate became rarer. Players who had spent years developing approaches based partially on working individual umpires, knowing which umpires gave pitchers the outside corner, which ones squeezed the zone, which ones had tendencies that a smart hitter could exploit, suddenly found themselves facing a system with no tendencies at all. The zone was the zone. Every game. Every count. Every pitcher. Every batter. When the technology reached the major leagues, it arrived not as a complete replacement for human umpires but as a challenge and review system, a tool that could be used to check calls, overturn decisions, and, most importantly, create accountability for a level of accuracy the sport had never previously been able to enforce. For most umpires, the adjustment was manageable. Their call accuracy was already high enough that the technology confirmed more than it corrected. For CB Buckner, the adjustment was something else entirely. The specific game that ended Buckner's career began like any other. Lineups posted. Infield warm-ups completed. National anthem played. First pitch thrown. And then, almost immediately, the system started working. The first overturned call came in the second inning. A pitch that Buckner called a strike, a called third strike that ended the inning and sent a hitter back to the dugout shaking his head, was reviewed and reversed. Ball. The at-bat continued. The second came in the fourth inning. A check swing ruling that went against the Dodgers, challenged by the manager, reviewed by the system. Overturned. By the time the third reversal happened in the fifth inning, the stadium had shifted into a different kind of attention. The crowd wasn't just watching the game anymore. They were watching the umpire. They were watching the technology. They were watching history being made in real time, even if most of them couldn't quite articulate what kind of history it was. The fourth and fifth reversals came within the same half inning. Back to back. 2 consecutive calls, both overturned, both confirmed by the tracking system to have been incorrect by margins that were not close. Not borderline. Not the kind of calls that reasonable people could look at and understand both sides. Wrong. Clearly and documentably wrong. By the sixth reversal, the Dodgers manager had seen enough. What happened in the dugout and then on the field in the minutes that followed was described by everyone who witnessed it as one of the most charged exchanges between a manager and an umpire in recent memory. Not because of the volume, though the volume was significant. But because of the context. Because everyone in that stadium, everyone watching on television, everyone following the game on their phones knew exactly what this argument was really about. It wasn't about one call. It was about 30 years of calls. And the fact that for the first time in those 30 years, there was a system in place that could prove, beyond any argument, that they had been wrong. The manager was ejected. Buckner stood his ground. And Shohei Ohtani, watching from the on-deck circle where he had been preparing for his at-bat, said nothing. He was speechless. Shohei Ohtani does not argue with umpires. This is not simply a temperament observation. It is a documented, consistent, repeatedly confirmed aspect of how he plays the game. In a sport where arguing ball and strike calls is practically a cultural tradition, where managers have made entire careers out of performing theatrical disagreements that fire up the crowd and make the highlight reel, Ohtani simply plays. He has faced questionable calls throughout his career. Every hitter has. It is the nature of a sport where a human being stands 60 feet from the plate and judges, in fractions of a second, whether a ball traveling at 95 miles per hour crossed an invisible three-dimensional zone that changes based on the height of each individual batter. Ohtani takes his information to the next at-bat. He adjusts. He moves forward. So when Shohei Ohtani was visibly, observably speechless, when the cameras caught the expression on his face and broadcast it to millions of people watching around the world, that said something. Not because he was angry. Not because he was celebrating. But because he was witnessing something he understood the full weight of, and that weight had momentarily taken his words away. 30 years. 6 calls in one game. A manager ejected. An umpire finished. The game was changing in front of his eyes. And he understood what that meant better than almost anyone on that field. Those were the words CB Buckner reportedly said in the moments after his ejection became inevitable and the reality of his situation settled around him on the field. "I've been doing this for 30 years. It is a sentence that contains an entire career. An entire life in the sport. 30 years of early morning flights and late-night drives between cities. 30 years of missed family events and holidays worked and summers spent in uniform under stadium lights while the rest of the world lived its normal life. 30 years is not nothing. It demands acknowledgement. It deserves respect. But baseball, as a sport that has always been obsessed with its own data and statistics and the precise measurement of performance, was no longer in a position to allow longevity to substitute for accuracy. 30 years of experience and 30 years of documented errors were now both visible in the same light. The technology did not care how long CB Buckner had been doing this. It only cared whether the pitch was in the zone. And in that single brutal equation, something shifted permanently in how professional baseball would evaluate the men who officiate its games. Not just Buckner. Every umpire. Because the message sent by 6 overturned calls in one game was not subtle. It was not open to interpretation. The era of the untouchable umpire was over. Within hours of the game ending, the coverage was everywhere. Sports networks ran the replay packages. Every reversal documented, time-stamped, analyzed. Former players were brought into studios to share their reactions. Managers who had been ejected by Buckner in years past were quoted. The statistics on his call accuracy, now available because the tracking systems had been quietly compiling data throughout the period when they were used for review purposes, were published and discussed in detail. The American sports media, which covers baseball with an intensity that occasionally borders on the theological, understood immediately that this was not simply a story about one bad umpire having a bad game. This was the story of a transition. A before and after. A line drawn through the history of the sport separating the era when the umpire's word was effectively final from the era when the umpire's word could be checked against reality and found correct or incorrect with a precision that no human perception could dispute. Umpires like Buckner had existed in every generation of the sport's history. Every era had its controversial officials. Every era had players and managers and fans who felt that certain calls had cost certain games in certain moments that mattered. But in every previous era, the argument always ended the same way. You could complain. You could argue. You could get ejected. But you could never actually prove, beyond the shadow of a doubt, with data that anyone could examine, that the call was wrong. Now you could. And that changed everything. Shohei Ohtani has been one of the most precise hitters in the game since the moment he arrived in American baseball. His approach at the plate is not accidental. He studies pitchers with the same detailed attention he applies to his own physical preparation. He understands zones and counts and tendencies and percentages with a sophistication that most analysts describe in genuinely reverent terms. Which means he also understands, better than most, exactly how much a bad ball strike call can disrupt an at-bat. Not just emotionally, though it does that too, but mechanically. Because if a pitcher knows that a certain pitch in a certain location gets called a strike regardless of where it actually lands, that pitch becomes a weapon. Not because of its quality, but because of the environment around it. For a hitter like Ohtani, who reads every variable and builds his approach around accurate information, the inconsistency introduced by unreliable officiating was always a hidden tax on performance. The automated system eliminates that tax. For Ohtani, playing out the final years of a career that is still producing at an historic level, this matters. For the young players in the Dodgers system who are developing their approaches now, it matters even more. They will build their games in an environment where the zone is consistent and knowable in a way it simply never was before. The sport will be different. Not because one umpire had a bad day. But because on the day CB Buckner had 6 calls overturned in a single game, baseball finally found the language to say clearly and permanently what it had always suspected but never been able to prove. The calls were wrong. The game deserved better. And now, finally, it has it. Nobody expected the transition to feel this way. Everyone knew the automated systems were coming. The announcement had been made. The timeline had been set. The technology had been tested and refined and approved and scheduled. But knowing something is coming and actually watching it arrive are two entirely different experiences. Watching CB Buckner stand on that field after the 6th reversal, hearing those words, "I've been doing this for 30 years, and understanding that 30 years of experience had just met the one opponent it could not argue with, could not outlast, and could not appeal to the front office about. The technology doesn't have a front office. It has data. And Shohei Ohtani, speechless on the field, understood the weight of that data better than anyone. Because he had spent his entire career performing at a level that produced data so extraordinary that the numbers themselves became the story. Now the officiating would be held to the same standard. The king of bad calls was finished. And baseball was just getting started.